There we go. Good morning. I'm fighting off the plague, so if you can't hear me or if I just go into a coughing fit, I apologize. But I'm also a pacer, so if you don't mind, I'm going to pace. Which is great for the people behind the pulse, because either every so often you'll have a good opportunity to see me or a better opportunity not to. You might be wondering why, when I talk about radical change agents, I put up a picture of a panda bear. It is not because I believe that panda bears are somehow radically into change, but I do have a funny joke about a radical panda bear. You didn't think there were one. A panda walks into a bar, orders a grilled cheese sandwich, sits, eats the grilled cheese sandwich, stands up, pulls out a machine gun, and starts blowing away every bottle of liquor he can find and heads for the door. The bartender shocks. Why in the world would you do that? And the panda says, I'm a panda, look it up. So the bartender, of course having a dictionary under the bar, flips to panda and says, pandas, eat, shoots, and leaves. Come on, it's a grammar joke. I've been increasingly interested in definitions these days. Part of what I've been doing over the past year is looking at participatory librarianship, and part of that has been on the future of libraries. And so when we came out with the technology draft on participatory libraries, and we talked about the library as conversation, we got a lot of people who were not very happy with us. Well, we got a few. We got one, but we were very unhappy with it. And he kept saying conversation, which we're going to come back to. That's just informal chat among people in person, and you're using it wrong, and you're kind of. And we were going back and forth. He goes, well, look at the definition. I got really interested in definitions. So I thought as we would look at change in librarianship, we should start with where we are. And so here's the definition of a library. A building or room containing a collection of books, periodicals, and sometimes films, and recorded music for people to read, borrow, or refer to. Or a collection of books and periodicals held in a building or a room, a collection of films, recorded music, a series of books, a room in a private house, or a collection of computer programs. I'm not thrilled with this definition. I imagine that you folks aren't thrilled with this definition either. But I think we have some room to complain. Because I looked this up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and I then looked up the definition of a dictionary, which is a book that lists the words of a language in alphabetical order and gives the meaning or gives the equivalent words in a different language. So I said, hey, this is fun. What's a book? A written or printed work consisting of pages glued or sewn together along with one side and bound in covers. Now, the reason you're saying, Dave, this is fun, we can go on for forever, is that I'm looking this definition up in the dictionary, but I'm looking it up in the online dictionary, in which I can find no thread, no glue, or no binding. Words change. Words change all the time. Meanings change. And it's very interesting in that I'm looking this up in the Oxford English Dictionary because there's no better evidence of how words change and how the fact that language and the words we refer to each other and the concepts we use are a product of conversation. They're a process. If some of you may be familiar with this book, The Professor and the Madman, if you're not, go read it. It's the only book I ever recommended on writing a dictionary. Now we laugh, but the truth is some of you in here have read books that you would recommend on writing a dictionary that have nothing about a psychotic Civil War soldier. Right? It's a book, you know, if you don't know the story, here it is in 10 seconds. What happens is a bunch of rich white guys in England say, hey, we should document the language, it should take about 3 years, let's go do it. And 15 years later, in the death of someone, they figure it out. And what they do is they go to other rich white guys, and they say, read everything in the 17th century, read everything in the 16th century, read everything in the 15th century, and every time you find a term, tell us what that term is, what its use was, and what the citation was, and send it in. And they send it into Oxford, and they put them in all these wonderful books and such. And it turns out that one of their most prolific contributors was a former Civil War soldier who was in an insane asylum for murder. I think I gave away the ending, but anyway. What's great about this is it shows that language comes from use. Definitions come from how we use them and how we interpret them. They're not handed down. They're not static. In fact, the minute they finished this, they started on the revisions and the revisions and the second edition. And they said, this is an incredibly hard problem. Knowledge is dynamic. How we look at the world, how we understand the world, how we interpret the world is a constantly evolving and changing process. And this dynamism, this accelerated, crazy, relational threading of information in our heads is a great time to be a librarian, because ultimately that's our role, that's our job. Now, knowledge is created through conversation. And I'm going to talk about that in a little greater detail, but stick with me for a second. The way we learn is we talk about things. Sometimes we talk to ourselves about things. Sometimes we talk amongst groups. But what we're doing is we're engaging in a back and forth information exchange to try and understand the world. Libraries, I would argue, and I think I'd find few people would argue against me, are in the knowledge business. This is our job. We're not in the book caretaking business. We're not in the stuff business. We're not in the Dewey business. We're in the knowledge business. Well, if knowledge is created through conversation, and libraries are in the knowledge business, therefore, libraries are in the conversation business. And I would argue that that's our primary business. That's what we are in the job of doing, is facilitating conversation to facilitate knowledge in the parts of our communities. Our communities are our schools, our faculty, our students. There are conversations going on. There are conversations of learning. And we need to know a little bit more about what that is. Now, I would also argue as we get farther in that this shift, while it seems nice and rhetorical and fancy and you can say it easily, has pretty dramatic consequences for how we do our work. Has pretty radical change implications for how we do our work. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about that. But first I want to go back to this. That when I say conversation, that's not a metaphor. When I say learning is done through conversation, knowledge is created through conversation, I don't mean it's done in this sort of like way. I mean it's done through conversation. And there's some specific, this is a fellow by the name of Gordon Pask, who was a cybernetician in the 60s and 70s. And he developed something called conversation theory. What he was doing is setting out to teach machines how to think. This was during the height of AI days when we were all going to be flying around in our flying cars and jetpacks, and our computers would be talking to us and making dinner for us, and we'd be eating the new pills, and etc. But AI was the way to go. And so he looked at it and said, how am I going to teach machines to think? And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, until artificial intelligence catches up, I'm going to start with natural intelligence, I'm going to look at how people learn. And so he looked at it and he said, people learn through conversation. People gain and develop knowledge, what he would call knowing as an active process, through conversation. And a conversation has a couple of parts. The first thing that a conversation has is conversance, people engage. Right? Now, being a cybernetician, being, British trained, you can't just say people, and the truth is it's not people, they're cognitive agents. What does that mean? Your academic libraries, get used to it. Just another joke to make up for the panda joke. How many faculty members does it take to change a light bulb? One. They simply hold the light bulb up and wait for the world to revolve around them. Yeah, you say that, but you're going to be using it. All right. So what is a conversant? Conversant is one to anything. Conversant means we're talking, right? One person talking, how's it going? We're doing well. All right, great. One person can talk to many, but we're acting as two different places. Two people can talk. Organizations can talk. The last time that you negotiated a contract with a vendor, that was a conversation. You were going back and forth and trying to come up with agreements, and you were the two parties in the conversation. Right? We can scale up. Societies can talk. You can also scale down, and those of you who are instructional librarians or work in instruction know this as critical thinking or metacognition, where we actually teach people to talk to themselves. I'm looking for this information. What am I doing now? Why am I choosing this information? Reflection, back and forth. So even if it looks like one person is sitting and reading, they're having a conversation. How does what I'm reading fit in with what I know? Do I agree with it? Conversation. We learn through conversations. We exchange, what are these conversants doing? Well, they're taking turns to exchange language back and forth. All right, now this is the fancy terminology. They exchange language on multiple levels, primarily L0 or L1. Oh God, help me, what is this? It gets practical, I promise. Well, actually, we're going to make it real practical. Angela's in the audience. She's on the research team that's helped come up with these concepts, so blame her on this one. No. L1 language means that we're talking with knowledge of the domain we're talking about. Think of it as two people who know what they're talking about, two experts talking about the world, right? So that might be my wife and I talking about our children, even though we know nothing, at least we equally know nothing about it. Right? It might be two librarians talking about the field of librarianship. L0 is a very functional directed language. It's from someone who knows what they're talking about to someone who doesn't. And so in many education settings we see this. If you've done software training, click here, then click here, then click here. It's very directional. There's very little questioning going back and forth. There's very little probing. It's very directional. And of course, good training wants to take us from L0 world to L1 level, right? So that we know that bad software training is click here, then click here, then click here, and that's all you tell them, right? You want to say click here because, and that will therefore click because you get a better sense and understanding of the world, okay? Now, why do I bring up this sense of L1 and L0? I want you to think about for a moment catalogs, right? That's the theme here. Are they dead, alive, or et cetera? Think about your catalog and think about its use of language. Okay? Think about when a naive user comes up to a catalog. What language do they have to exchange back and forth to that system? Very little. Now think about a librarian approaching the catalog. What kind of interaction can it have? What kind of language use of the domain understanding can it have? Very high. Is it any wonder that librarians are very good at using the catalog? No, because they design them. They understand what collocation is. They understand what index terms are. They understand what fields we're looking at, what classification. They understand this huge world of knowledge. And so when they approach a system, they can be very sophisticated in their use. And it works really well. You look at the user studies. Do catalogs work? Ask the librarian. Yes, they do. Ask the patron. What the hell? Now, a learning system is a system that brings people from an L0 world up to an L1 world. And you say, oh, yeah, well, our catalogs don't do that. But what's interesting, when you look at the library operations, how many libraries that you guys are in offer some form of instruction? You're the learning part of the system, right? The idea is, we're not letting the system bring someone up to speed. We'll do it. We'll teach them how to. We used to call it bibliographic instruction. Now we simply call it instruction. But what we're trying to do there is bring people from an L1 to an L0 versus having the system do it versus having the system sort of recognize that they have their own scope and impact of language. So we have language going back and forth. And the level at which the conversants are at with that language is going to determine how rich and powerful and interesting it is. Okay? What are they doing is they're seeking agreements. So as we're sitting here talking, if you hear me listening, right? Every so often I stop and go, okay, right, yeah, makes sense. What I'm doing is I'm seeking an agreement. I'm seeing someone nod their head, and I'm seeing hopefully not people go. Right? And in fact, what's interesting is when you look in distance education mode versus in-person mode, that's what you don't get necessarily. And in fact, a lot of your instruction at distance is trying to make it okay for people to make explicit that they don't understand. They're trying to make okay to type. Right? But what we're doing is we're seeking agreements. Now, those agreements then get stored in sort of our memory. Now, what Pass would call an entailment mesh. What's interesting about that memory, what's interesting about the entailment mesh is that, one, it's active and dynamic. That as you understand something, as you go through life understanding other things, it will change what you understood to begin with. It's not static. So many of you have done this. You've read a book 10 years ago, you come back and read it again, and you're like, when did that part happen? Or, wasn't this a bigger scene in it? Or, boy, I didn't realize that what this was about. Last night I was reading Oh, the Places You'll Go with Dr. Seuss to my 8-year-old. Right? He was reading it to me, which is even better. And I said, well, what's that book about, Riley? He said, well, it's about sometimes you're going to win, sometimes you're going to lose, and sometimes you'll get stuck, but at least you'll have a balloon. I thought that was pretty good for an 8-year-old. Trust me, at a 5-year-old, he didn't get that much out of it. And I said, Riley, why do you think my mom and dad gave this to me when I finished my PhD studies? Yeah. That's not it. Anyway. So this idea of an entailment mesh is one, life changes, but two, it's relational. The way we understand things is because it's related to other things. How many times have you struggled with a concept? And only when you get it, you go, oh, it's like this. You're relating knowledge together. How things juxtapose. Now, once again, those instructional librarians have heard this all before. They go, this is scaffolding. This is, the idea of a spiral curriculum, learning theory stuff. So I want to give you an example from my favorite historian in the whole world and a broadcaster by the name of James Burke. And he did a series of television broadcasts called Connections, then The Day the Universe Changed, and what he does is he looks at history in a very different way. So what he's doing is he's looking at how the world changes. And he had this great example that I'm going to run you through pretty quickly on how the North winning the US Civil War led to the modern computer revolution. So he takes these threads. Here it is. In the US Civil War, the South should have won. At the time, the contemporary military thinking was, the more men you could muster to the field, the greater your chance of victory. And the South was more populous than the North, so they should have won. But when you looked at coincidences of geography, the South was primarily agrarian, and the North was primarily industrial. But what that meant was the North could produce more artillery. They could make more cannons. And so when they came to the battlefield and the Southerners lined up and the Northerners lined up, the Northerners brought like 20 cannons and the Southerners brought 1. This equalized the world for them. There's a problem though with cannons, which is cannons don't work like normal firearms. You can't just point at the bad guy, pull the trigger, and it go boom and knock him down. What they do is they fire in what's called a ballistic arc. So what you have to do is you have to change the angle to change the distance. Now, for some of you around may not know this, but the way in which you determine what angle to what distance is it's determining the area under an arc, which is calculus. You can't do this on the back of your hand, and if you're a typical northern soldier, you can't do this at all. And so what they used to do is they have rooms full of people called computers, which were mathematicians, and what they would do is figure out, given this size of the cannon, given this much powder, given this angle, given this distance, they come up with a table. So now that northern soldier, sitting in battle, would look at the table and say, they're about 500 yards away, put it at an X degree angle, and fire. This changed the equation so that the way to military victory was greater artillery. This carried on to World War I, and it carried on to World War II. The problem was in World War II, we were facing down Germany, which was an equal industrial, if not greater industrial capability than the Allies. And we began to produce more and more and more and bigger artillery to the point that we ran out of people and computers and time to calculate these tables. And so we had to automate the process, which led to the development of the first automated computers called ENIAC, which were run through vacuum tubes, digital computers. The problem with vacuum tubes is they're very fragile. And so when things like bugs, literally, walk into your computer, they can blow up vacuum tubes, which brings the system down. So we needed to replace vacuum tubes. We found out you wait for 2 layers of silicon on top of each other, you get something called a transistor, which at low power has the same effect as a vacuum tube, but it also has the capability that we can shrink it and shrink it and shrink it and shrink it and begin to put 1, 10, 20 million, 30 million, 40 million on top of a single chip, led to the integrated circuit, which is seen in the middle of the CPU, which led to the modern computer. Now, that's not causal, that's not linear. And using my really bad cataloging skills, as I understand that story, we started in the Civil War period, moved over to field artillery, down to analytic mechanics because I brought in calculus. Then we had military history. Then, let's see, we went over to electronic computers and computer science, took a twist into electronic circuits with the transistors, and then finally went back into computer engineering and hardware, and ended up in electronic computers and computer science. It doesn't fit into the schema. Doesn't fit. This is a problem with our catalogs, is that our catalogs are based around a single view of the universe, a single conversation of history. And yet, what's increasingly happening, which is when we seek to understand the world, it's relational, it's dynamic, it's crazy, and it's changing. And so we wonder why people have a hard time navigating the system, because we don't think this way. I hate to break it to you, but as librarians, you're abnormal. It's not normal. We don't born speaking LCSH. We're not born speaking Dewey, right? Now, I want to be really clear. This is not lists in the catalog, right? So when we look at the catalog, we say, oh, we can make, we'll just add a little bit. We just add this little bit. The catalogs will be fine. We keep looking for that little bit to make our catalogs like this. And so the first thing we do is we put lists in. Now what people can do is they can go through the same catalog with the stuff, but they can make lists. So that's a list. No problem. Solve the problem. Here's the problem with lists. Come back. If I took that off and you came back in 6 months and I asked, what is this list of? You would have no clue. No idea. This idea that somehow we're going to make lists, that's great for breadcrumbs, but what's really interesting is not these things. What's really interesting is the lines and connections between these things. It's not the stuff. It's the relationships of the stuff. So we learned this a long time ago. You never produce a bibliography. You produce an annotated bibliography. It's not just a matter of what's the best stuff for X. It's why it's the best stuff for X. Right? And it's not tags in the catalog. Now, are my pen tag people here? Oh, good, we can talk about it. No. No, if you look at pen tags, which I know is the next session, look at it. It's not in the catalog. It's things that are in the catalog they can tag, but they can also tag web pages and they can tag all this other stuff. So, oh, that's all right. We can fix our catalog problem. We'll throw tags at it. Good frickin' luck. Because what's the problem? Tags, for example, are great for temporal understanding of a domain. Which means that if you get a lot of people tagging things at a given time, you can understand what they were thinking at that point in time. The problem is tags don't expire. Right? The problem is with folksonomies. People say, oh, folksonomies, tagging. Libraries have known that a long time, threw it away. Uncontrolled keywords, we don't need those. But what we need to understand is uncontrolled keywords are very powerful if they're part of an evolutionary process that turns them into controls or not controls. Language is evolving, language is developing. But the problem here with tagging in the catalog, not tagging in general, but tagging in the catalog, is that what we're doing is tagging stuff. We're tagging stuff. Our catalogs are all about stuff. We shouldn't even call them catalogs. You know what they are? They're inventory systems. Let's just call them that. When you look at what's in those catalogs, it's where something is. Not why it's there, how it's used for, what's related to the world. It's where stuff is. We need that. You need that. They, not so much. Right? They only need that after they need to know that's the thing I want. Then they need to know where it is. So are catalogs dead? No. Should catalogs be the primary interface to the public? No. Right? This is also not socializing the catalog. It sounds like something we do to freshmen. The idea that somehow we're going to take these, it's like lipsticks on a pig. We're going to take the catalog, we're going to make it social. Why? It's not social to begin with. But somehow that we're going to take every book and allow people to comment on it. That we're going to let them tag it or rate it. I mean, forget the idea of God help us, we're going to let users add data to our system, but we're going to let them catalog it, and that's going to make the catalog social. The problem is the catalog is not a social process to begin with, and so why is it? Look at Amazon and look at the number of comments on a book. Now look at WorldCat, which has the exact same functionality, and look at the number of comments on a book. There is a difference, right? One, what are they commenting on? If you look at a lot of the comments they're making in Amazon, it has very little to do with the actual book that they're talking about. A lot of it's, oh, this is a much better book than this book. Oh, this is, it's interesting, if you read the first Harry Potter book, you'll understand what happened in book 2 and 7. So are they talking about the first book? Or are they talking about the series? Right? How many times have you run in, all our serials librarians and monograph librarians, and looked at the catalog, and the catalog just sort of sneers at you when you talk about creating collections within it? Right? It's about things. But knowledge isn't about things. Knowledge is about connections and relationships. So let me give you an example, make this a little bit more real. We were working with a group here at Syracuse Libraries on the electronic reserve system. Now these pages are slightly out of date but you can still do it. So the first thing you do is you go up to find a reserve, and you get this screen. And by the way, if anyone sneers at this not from Syracuse University, I'm glad to use you guys as the example next time. Right, and so you go in, you enter your instructor, you enter your course number, you enter what have you, and you end up with the list of stuff. Right? And we say, oh, this is not very interesting, this is not exciting, it's not relational. How could we make this better? How could we socialize this thing? And so we came up with this interface. And we said, okay, what we need is, we have articles, we got my books, we got my classes, my feeds, stuff, who knows, friends, you gotta have friends. If it's a Web 2.0 social thing, it's got to have friends. I'm on MySpace. I got Tom as my friend. It's horrible. But why do we need friends? I don't know. But good news is, there's the article. This is the bibliographic stuff. We want to be able to ask a librarian. That's cool. We just stole this from Library Thing directly. Got to have tags. Got to have clouds, because that's cool. And then, we'll mash it up with Amazon information. And now we have a Web 2.0 reserve system. Here's the problem. We looked at this and we said, no. There's wrong. In fact, what we started calling this was the PDF aggrandizement screen. Everything on this screen is about a thing. Everything on this screen is about a PDF file. It has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with how I understand the world. It has nothing to do with, what's the difference between an article and a book? What is the difference between an article? When it comes down to it, if you're in a class and you have to read something, what is the difference between an article and a book? Nothing.
It takes longer.
They're thicker and I can hurt people when I throw them. Right? And why aren't articles and books in my classes? What's the difference there? And what's the stuff here? What do I need friends for a PDF file? So we looked at this and we said, this isn't quite it. Because there's nothing more fundamentally conversational in an academic setting than the class you're taking, because that's what classes are. Classes are conversations. They're learning. They're people discussing things. So we went back to the drawing board and came to this. And we said, first of all, we have conversations. That conversation may be about a class. It may be about a book. It may be about my next novel. It may be about what I'm going to do on Friday night. I have conversations. So in this case, I have a conversation about a class I'm taking. And the first thing I want to know is the syllabus. Right? Because what is the syllabus? Think about this. When you take the reserves and you take a syllabus and you put all the stuff on reserve and you throw away the syllabus, what you've done is build this beautiful relational tree and lop the top right off of it. So I don't know why these things are sitting together. When many syllabi are talking about sequence, you need to read this, then you need to read that, what part of it you need to read, why you need to read. A syllabus is like an initial part of a conversation in a class, and it belongs at the point of where we're trying to understand the world. So there's the syllabus, and that syllabus points to articles and it points to books and materials, but why stop there? Because now, as I'm reading the syllabus, it's got an assignment. And the assignment's to find a picture, so I found a picture. And then I said, you know, I like this picture, I'm going to email the artist, and there's the response of the email. Which is, why do we say, now you've got the stuff. You came to the library, you got the stuff. Now the conversation's done. And what's amazing is, we talk about getting into things like Blackboard. We should be in Blackboard. It's a great place to have conversations, but we shouldn't be sitting on the top level away from it all. We should be right in the course area. And we should be sucking stuff back out of Blackboard and not just pushing stuff into Blackboard, because that's where we're developing these conversations, which are the lifeblood of the institutions we're part of. So now I have a relationship. This is related to that. And now when I click on this Ask the Librarian thing, guess what goes to the librarian if I want? The whole kibosh. Now instead of having to start with, have you searched Google? The #1 most insulting question you can ask a patron. And right up there with, did you tie your shoes today? It's like, duh, I wouldn't be here if I didn't start with Google. Right? Now you can say, yeah, look, there's the Google search, and there's the this, and you can instantly see the domain they're working with, so you can cut out a lot of the really uncomfortable parts of reference interviews. I do another talk where we develop this into a virtual reference system with scapes and such. You can see it online, but the point is I get this relationship, and when I click on one of the items, that's when it makes sense to bring this stuff up. But now this PDF file is in the context, or in this case a book, is in the context of the conversation, not in and of itself. And we realized as we looked at this, what we've developed is a migration path away from catalogs and into conversational systems. So now when someone comes in and they click on this book, they can also say, who else has read this book? Here are my notes. Who else has notes for my class? Who else has notes on this book if they're not in my class? Why is this book that I'm reading in information studies being used in anthropology? Maybe there's some anthropology courses I can take. And suddenly, we have all these conversations, which are linking resources and materials in the catalog, but instead of linking them by Library of Congress subject heading, they're linking them by real conversations and real use. And so this stays. It just goes under this. If you look at a lot of the innovation you see in catalogs these days, they're burying them under shells. You saw that originally with Ann Arbor District Library, which is buried under Drupal, where they could build their own interface. You see that in, North Carolina, where they put another search system on top of it. You see the idea of, we need an inventory system. It belongs there. That's fine. We just need a better interface for our patrons. And so this is pointing to all that material, but eventually this becomes more useful because it's about connections, it's about understanding. Now compare this approach to traditional reductionism. Reductionism is where we take a phenomenon and we keep breaking it down to smaller and smaller parts. In organizational theory, Max Weber developed something called bureaucracies. He said, as large organizations are dealing with the world, what they begin to do is specialize and specialize and specialize until you get someone at the bottom of this really deep tree structure that understands everything about a certain aspect and nothing about aspects on either side. But they all report up to the magic understanding. Right? This is the great tree. Well, scientists, academia matches this. What's really fascinating is the world that we're in has built a reward system around the idea of reductionism, which is reduce pond size until fish is biggest. What does that mean? I'm studying library and information science. Oh, other people are doing that. I'm doing reference. Oh, other people are doing that. I'm doing virtual reference. Oh, other people are doing that. I'm doing systems within virtual reference. And you keep going until I'm the #1 person in the world in the study of technical systems in one-to-one interchanges in public libraries in the northwest of Uganda. Yes, can you take it? Right? That's what it's all about. Reductionism. Now, what's the problem with reductionism is if you break something down into its smaller and smaller parts, you forget to put it back together and realize this is something that kills people. Library science has suffered from reductionism. We have suffered badly from reductionism. Dewey Decimal System. What? AACR2. AACR2 is a great way of taking the most obscure idea and taking it to the most obscure level of understanding. Right? Now, Dave, we still need to do that. We need to recognize, library science recognizes the reality of conversation, but reduces it to a single conversation. If I said to you, I've gone lots of miles and talked to lots of librarians, and I said, we're all about capturing conversations. And every librarian has said, yeah, cool, I like that, that's fun. And then you say, but that's going to change the world. No. Dewey, that's a conversation. It is. If you think about the Dewey Decimal System, or Library of Congress, God help us, they're conversations. What they are is the Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress is the result of a conversation about how do we organize the world. And it's a result of a reductionist approach to how do we organize the world, which is we start with the world and we keep subdividing and subdividing and subdividing until there's no more room. We suck the air out of life and turn it into a class. Right? And then we try and put it back together with things like Ferber. Right? Or Web of Science. How much money are we spending on Web of Science every year? But what's amazing to me is, why do we spend the money? Because the academy and libraries recognize the intense interest and power of conversation. Citations are a form of conversation. What you're doing is you're linking diverse sets of information in an argument. And so when I go up for tenure, I need to show that I have that impact. How do I show impact? People have referred to what I'm talking about. So why is it that libraries, as part of academia, have spent so much time on the front of the book with what its title is and who wrote it, and we pay other people to pay attention to the back of the book which is the citations and information, which is key to what we do. We've suffered from reductionism. We understand there's a conversation, but what we do is we reduce it to one to reduce the level of complexity. What does that mean? Think of it for a moment that if I asked you to capture every conversation at Grand Central Station in the middle of at rush hour, what would you do? First of all, what you do is tell everyone to stop and stand still. Then what you would begin to do is say things like, everyone having a personal conversation on this side, everyone having a business conversation on this side. Everyone having a business conversation, medical, legal, you know, accounting, whatever. And we keep breaking it down until they're small enough groups that we can go and say, what is this table? What is this table? Right? That's what we do. And that makes sense if you're in Grand Central at rush hour. Now, I would argue that every day you use a radically different approach to organize conversations. It's called the radio. As we sit here and speak, thousands of electronic signals are coursing through your body, from cell phones to radio signals to what have you. But they don't interrupt this conversation, right? So what do? We have a piece of technology that when we want a conversation, we tune it in. It doesn't stop the other ones. It just allows us to focus on one. And then what we can do if we're really fancy is we can co-locate them. Well, this is my rock stations go on 1 and 2, and this is my talking go on 2 and 3, etc. Right? That's the idea that technology allows us now, has caught up to the reality. It's not that we do this because technology allows it, it's because technology has finally caught up to how we really think. So the idea of noise reduction in the catalog is based on a physical model. It is based on the idea that we had to subdivide the world because we could only put it in one place. Now, with technology, we can put it anywhere. We could have done this in the 60s when we first built our OPACs, but now it's really cool because we can give them graphics. We can now allow those books virtually to sit anywhere in these conversations, be referenced by millions of people in radically different ways. Now, if you go back to the L1, L0 garbage conversation, what that means is when someone approaches a system, they don't have to get stuck with one L1. Meaning, in order to really work the system, I got to learn to be a librarian. In order to truly impact and use the catalog to its highest potential, you need to become a librarian. What social systems, what social networks and Flickr and all these things say is no. We want lots and lots of different L1s. Organize the world according to your domain and your knowledge, and then it turns out an interesting thing happens. Which is if you do that, if you allow people to use their own language and their own structures and their own linkages, when you aggregate them together, magic occurs. Which is, we're not all radically different. Sure, there are going to be outliers. But there are a lot of times when we use the same words to talk about the same thing. That's how we live in a society. And through this aggregation of these individual language domain stuff, you get cool things like tag clouds. Tag clouds only work because every individual uses their own terms and we look that there's commonality among them. And that's interesting. So when we look at the catalog, when we look at the interface, why do we say stop? Forget all your knowledge. Forget all your domain information. You got to learn ours. Drives me nuts. Think about it. If I come in and I'm a physicist, and I'm a world-class physicist, why do I have to become a librarian in order to access the physics literature? Well, guess what? They don't. Or, and we also do ourselves a disservice, just as a side, which is, why don't we on a regular basis, and I know some libraries do, but not enough, do citation analyses for tenure cases? We used to. Why don't we do it now? Because I had a colleague calling, I'm going in for tenure, I need to do a citation analysis. Well, if you come down or send your GA down, in 15 or 20 minutes, we can teach you everything you need to know. We can teach you our core skill and the thing that we got our master's degree on in 15 or 20 minutes and you'll be fine. It's nuts. It's crazy. So, but our systems do this. New knowledge is gained from the intersection of silos. How many of your academies that you're part of have some sort of interdisciplinary initiative? Usually out of the provost office, we all have to kumbaya together, right? We want the engineers and the management people and the arts people to spend some time together in magical events. Why is that? Because new knowledge comes from the intersection of silos. Because what we've done in the academy, because of this reward system, is we've become so specialized and narrowed that we're squeezing the last ounces of blood out of these stones. that we suddenly realize, if I talk to the person next to me, radically new, interesting things happen. Now, what's interesting is when you look at these initiatives, libraries are perfectly situated for these initiatives because, by and large, libraries already sit between all of these silos. And if we started paying attention to the conversations that our academics are having and not simply serve them and let them walk away, we can be that connective tissue that connects all these silos together. If you want a successful interdisciplinary initiative on your campus, start with the library and ask, what are people reading? What are they looking at? What's the theory? What do these theories have in common? How do the students look at it? What are the students doing? Who can answer this question better than the librarians? Librarians function as authorities, not authoritarians, which means we're rather agnostic when it comes to what's a good source and what's a bad source. I mean, this is what's amazing. Librarians are perfect in that we understand that what is defined as good and bad information is by context. It's by the question. It's by who asked me and what did they need. So when a professor comes in and he asks me for something with a quick, easy citation, I can just go ahead and give it to him. But when a student comes in, now I've got to teach him the value of scholarly communication, all that stuff, because I'm in a teaching role. We understand good answers and bad answers change on the context. We're honest brokers. People look to librarians as, one, they have respect for librarians. They have a mystique and a romanticism about librarians, but they don't see us as people with stakes. We become facilitators of our community conversations. We're tool builders. This gets me so frustrated. Librarians, I don't care if you've ever written a line of HTML code in your life, you're a tool builder. I don't care if you're on the reference desk, in cataloging, outreach, digital library, it doesn't matter, you're a tool builder. A Pathfinder is a tool. An annotated bibliography is a tool. We're used to building tools. And we provide this connective tissue to a community. This is what we do. We sit between all of these disciplines. What power do we have? We're perfectly situated, but we're not necessarily prepared. So, this is the radical change agent. Reductionism has taken its toll on our profession. We have built rigid borders around our profession. Think about this. Why is it that we think an ALA certified Masters of Library Science degree is everything you need in order to be a webmaster, the head of marketing, a director, bottle washer, instructional librarian, architect, everything in libraries of any value gets tied back to a single 2.5 years of your life that may have been 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 5 years ago. Right? Our union card. We need to think about that for a moment. And we even extend these barricades to the user. When we look at who's there, you talk about identity management. I'm going to get worked up. We talk about identity management. How many identities does a library have? How many types of people are in libraries? 2. Librarians and not librarians. Right? The chancellor walks in and they think you got a book wrong in your cataloging. Can the chancellor change it? No. Only librarian can. The user walks in, or if a physicist walks in and says you're missing the key in paper, can the physicist change it? No. They have to talk to a librarian. This is nuts. This is crazy. This is insane. We need to open this up so people, in essence, earn the right to work with these systems, that they're communal systems. We have a broken innovation cycle. Repeat after me. New hires are not the solution. Right? I did this in Oregon. It's like the 98-year-old person on oxygen who just graduated with their MLS degree comes in. It's like, look, there's the new librarian, the young kid. Why did we hire him? Well, they just came out of library school, so they must know all the cool technology stuff. Now we don't need to. We say that, we laugh, but I can't tell you the number of directors that I go to and I talk about, well, we should look at building and changing the catalog. Oh, let me bring Patty in. Patty's the new librarian. She's great. Right? Well, let me bring Bob in. Bob will do it. How long has Bob been working? A week. So we go to Bob and say, Bob, the most important thing we do is innovate. Go innovate. Person with the least cultural knowledge, least experience, least seniority, go innovate. And he goes up to his supervisor and says, I need to innovate. And the supervisor says, get back on the desk. This is a problem. Why don't we have a continuing education system, things like this, but on a regular basis? I've seen many libraries that require 36 hours of continuing education for every librarian in their staff. This is not a bad idea. And our systems are too closed and too incremental. This idea that somehow when we come up with the next bright idea, tagging on the catalog, we have to somehow put it in the queue of our vendor and wait. That's insane. Right? I'm not talking open source fanaticism. I'm talking about the idea that life changes too quickly to wait for a set of 30 programmers in some distant county with 500 employees to get around to it. We need to have a system where we can come up with a new thing, new innovation, and put it in. Now, everything's changing, just like always. This is one of my favorite quotes. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We need to realize that the people in this room, we may be a small group as part of the total population, but this is the size of the group we need to change all this. We need to change all this. We need to become radical change agents. And the first thing we need to do is innovate from core principles. We need to stop riding waves and be the wave machine. We need to focus on knowing and not artifacts. We need to realize we're not in the book and thing business, we're in the knowing and teaching business. Every part of our operation is in the knowing and thinking business. And you have to ask yourself, what is your library's vision of the future and where does it come from? Why are special collections and reference in the same organization? Why are catalogers and public service the same group of people with the same degree? What is that vision that we have? More of the same? Changing? Oh, we'll tag next week. Why? Let's blog. Why? I'm not against blogging. I'm a blogger. But I'll tell you, one more librarian blogging about librarianship will bring not one more patron into your buildings. What will is librarians willing to put their personal information and put up reader's advisory, believe it or not. All right? Why? Why do we do this? Because if we constantly chase the next wave, we're always going to be the second best whatever. If we constantly say Amazon's got the solution, our catalogs need to look like Amazon, we will have the second best looking Amazon site on the web, and trust me, that's not enough. Why do people look at Google as competition? It's crazy. You are not in competition with Google, you're not in the same business. Google's in the advertising business, right? By the way, look at that nice little Google box we're all going to. Is that an L0 or an L1 interface? It's an L0 interface. We know that we can put pluses and minuses and quotes and all that cool stuff, and we can do basically dialogue searching in Google. But there's nothing in Google that teaches you how to get from point A to point B. Maybe we could. Hey, there's an idea. We need to question tradition. It's not that we've done things wrong, it's that we did things right in a different world. The world is changing. In fact, the idea that somehow the internet is radically new and the whole universe is going off its tilt on its axis because it's brand new and if Twitter didn't exist, like people from the 18th century are going to come back and see Twitter and their heads will explode from the innovation. Right? The fact that we went from the average life expectancy of 40 to 75 within 40 years in the middle of the baby boom era will have a bigger impact on the world than the internet will. Right? Indoor plumbing had a bigger impact. Right? We've seen radical change. This is a radical change. And we don't just get through it by doing the stuff we always did. We're inspired by the past, but we don't try and copy it. We have to understand that it takes people to change the world, and you guys are the people. We need to hold visionaries to account. It's great to have David come in and give his come to Jesus speech. But I don't get to go home with you. And so what are you going to do tomorrow? Visionaries without the reality. Right? Beware mottos over intellectual signatures. I'll give you ours. School of Information Studies. We empower people through information. What does that mean? How do you change someone's life? What is it underneath that? What is it that's going to guide your next set of development? Because if it's, we are going to empower people through information, that's not enough. What's the vision? Beware the French Revolutionary. There goes my people. I must find where they're going so I may lead them. I want to be real clear. I think you should blog and tag and wiki your brains out. I really do. I really, really do. I think you should play with it. But I think you should have this wonderful discussion at the end of a week that says, now, what's going to actually change people knowing? How is this going to help instruct people? How is this going to help develop knowledge and connect them? What's the deeper purpose here? It can't be Twitter. Web 2.0 is not an end, because there will be a Web 3 and a 4 and a 5 and a 20. So you can't say our goal is to be Web 2.0, because congratulations, the minute you succeed, you're on to the next goal. Become a mentor. Here's my mentor. Ray Von Dran, who passed away last year, was a great teacher and a great man. And what he taught me was what a great mentor is. A great mentor is an unselfish person. It's a teacher who hopes that the student will surpass the mentor. A good mentor is someone that prays that you scare the hell out of them. A good mentor is someone who looks at you and says, you're going to have not my job, you're going to have my boss's job in 2 years. I'm going to work for you someday. That's what makes a great mentor, is they're unselfish and they're rare, and you need to be that. There is an obligation to leadership. First of all, I can't tell you the number of people I've heard where it's like, are you going to take the managerial job? No, I like what I'm doing. Oh, if I take that, I'm going to become one of them. Too bad. Become one of them. I tell you, we're looking for deans in our field. And there are many people who would make great deans who say, no, I don't want the administrative crap, I want to stay in research. And what that means is, no, I'm going to let the field struggle on its own and take second-class people to be the heads of the organizations, and that's not my problem. If you hate your director, replace them. Don't bitch about them. I mean, you replace them. It drives me nuts, right? So a few of my favorite quotes on this topic. Change is like heaven. Everyone thinks it's a great idea, but no one wants to go first. Or, to put that more bluntly, my father once told me, you can always tell a pioneer because they're the ones with the arrows in their ass. I'm asking you to be brave. I'm asking you. Suzanne Thor and I were having a brief conversation before we started, and we said, this is the greatest time to be a librarian because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But what that means is, we get to make it up. Cool! I mean, think about this. If you want a job where you know what you're going to be doing for the next 30 years, librarianship's going to be very uncomfortable. If you want, change will happen. Let me make this really clear. The world is changing. In the information domain, in the knowledge domain, it is changing amazingly rapidly. You can either be changed, or you can change it. Because ultimately, this is my final goal. You are the future of libraries. You are the radical change agents. You are the people who are going to relate or affect fundamental nature, far-reaching, thorough. You're not going to change it. What we need is people who are going to change librarianship. Not people who are going to change the catalog. Not people who are going to change the reference day. Not people who are going to just worry about the physical architecture. You need to be holistic, radical, fundamental change agents that look at the entire field and say, what should we be doing tomorrow? And this is the field that can do it. This is the field that looked at it and said, take the chains off the books. Let the people in the shelves. You are the people who looked at this and said, access to information is a fundamental right. This is the field that stood up to the Patriot Act and said, no, having people search information is a net positive, and it's fundamentally what we're about. Ultimately, you are the ones responsible for redefining this area. If libraries are obsolete in 10 years, it's your fault. It's my fault. And society will be the poorer for it. You are the fundamental agents we have to making this world a better place. That is a noble goal. That is a massive goal. And that is your goal. And I don't care if you're on the desk, I don't care if you're cataloging, I don't care if you're on the website. It is your goal to make society a better place. I don't care the size of your library, I don't care the number of students, I don't care the domains that you're in. Your job is to make society a better place. And now is the time to do it. And you have the skills to do it. And I ask you, I beg you to do it. Because every day we need to make the world a better place, and that future is in our hands. Thank you very much.
I'm going to have some questions.
Very good.
We do have some time for a few questions.
Because because there's nothing more better than after that than saying, oh, yeah, that's me.
Yes.
Which side? The side? Okay.
One of the problems I have with the way the library feels going, I'm wondering, we don't seem to be able to treat all the different businesses we're doing. I mean, if you're concentrating on the user and from an academic standpoint, obviously right now. But I think, we're not about artifacts. We're part of us. We do have to think of artifacts. And we don't have to just think of artifacts for the people now. We have to think about keeping the knowledge, keeping the whole stuff for the people 20 years, 50 years down the line.
What's the world going to look like?
What's
the world going to look like in 50 years?
I don't know, but I'd like to still have some of the stuff.
Which stuff?
Don't know, so we try to keep as much as we can.
Okay.
I mean, we have stuff in a library in Siena, a very tiny library from the 15th century. People still look at it.
That's great.
But
Here's my question.
There's a bunch of different.
There is.
That's
Comparing libraries to books is like comparing dentists to drills, which is it's the predominant thing in people's mind, and yet it's probably the least of what we do. And when we do our job very well, people don't notice. Right? When you walk out of the dentist and you didn't get drilled, you're like, geez, I brushed my teeth really well, thank God I did drill. Meanwhile, the dentist is sitting there going, and I scrape all that gunk off your teeth every 6 months. And I don't say, books, for example, materials, are not unimportant, but they are secondary. Right? What's amazing is we need to realize that books, videos, any static thing is an artifact of a conversation. And what's interesting is they're valueless until they're put into a context of use. So the example is a scholar was working on letters during the plague in England, and he was down in the room reading original letters and original manuscripts, and he had horrible hay fever and was going nuts. And this other scholar was sitting next to him, and he'd grab a whole group of documents and go, which is hard to do when you have a bad cold. And the guy just goes, what are you doing? He said, well, here's the deal. I'm tracing the root of the Black Plague through England. What? He goes, well, look, someone that has a plague in their village, they don't, word gets out, the village dies. No one brings them food, no one. So what they do is when they write a letter, they say, hi, everything's going great here. And then they put in a big pile of mail to get delivered, and they douse it in vinegar to disinfect it because they have the plague in the area. So you don't trace it by what they say, you trace it by where the vinegar smells. Now, what's interesting about that is those letters, the physical letters, are much more valuable to that person than the scan of them. And yet to the other one, it could have been scanned. Those contexts of understanding, those contexts of knowledge are changing radically each day. And what I'm worried about is that libraries concentrate on the letters, and so therefore they scan them because they want to preserve them and they don't know the use of them and the context of them. We need to be smarter about what the conversations we're going to support. You bring up a very valid point, which is we want to be able to have that material available for conversations in 100 years. It'll be interesting to see what those conversations are. I don't think we can predict them. But the other side of it is, with increased computing capacity, the notion of the physical artifact is only a small portion of what we do. What do we do about the fact that knowledge doubles every 18 months, and of that, 99.999% of it is digital information? What do we do about that? Right? But there are artifacts. The answer is, what do we preserve? How do we find it? Through conversation. Right? We need to engage the scholars in the domain to find out what's useful. That's a conversation with the scholars. We need to understand the people are producing it. Why did you produce this? I want to catalog the production value. That's a conversation with the producers. Not a collect and a buy and a store and a hoard. So I don't disagree that physical items are unimportant. I do disagree that physical items are of primary importance. I think they are secondary to the main task of conversations and learning.
I guess my point was is that we end up being charged with a lot more than what we're covered here. And it's hard to do it all.
It is, and unless we as a participatory librarianship is my try at it, but unless we as a field, and certainly unless you as a library, can clearly define what your role is, you will always be jumping from one thing to the next thing. And that's what scares me a lot. Please.
And I also think that there are, unfortunately, politics in this that are very powerful. In that, you're focusing right now on the student as the primary patron and maybe faculty, thinkers or learners or people seeking knowledge. as the primary audience, but is that really true for libraries, or is it accreditation? Is it tenure? Is it, you know, that whole peer-mediated publishing and that entire circle? So we have different, you know, there's a political and a reality financial basis, as well as the higher goals. And I think it's fascinating that you characterize Google as being in the advertising business, which I absolutely agree. They also have an underlying political and financial structure that isn't necessarily the most altruistic. So, you know, it's important for us to remember that we have to survive in the world as it is while we're trying to make the world of the future. And I think that some of these things we really have to think about. What are we accrediting when we're accrediting? What are the standards of accreditation? What are the signs of a good library? What are the signs of a thriving university or public library or community? You know, those are the questions that are not getting asked as much as I really wish they were. I mean, if we're all being evaluated on whether we have certain physical resources in the library, or the number of photocopiers, you know, this is really, I mean, what's the number of photocopiers? What do you care if it's all PDF and digital anyway? You know, it's like, so these are the questions I think we really have to start thinking about, how to evaluate, how to finance, how to do the political side of it, while we're actually changing the community we live in. I
think you're absolutely right. I think politics itself is a conversation. It's a conversation of power, and librarians often underestimate their own power in it. And I think, unfortunately, they often advocate those conversations to others, which is very problematic. I think the notion of being involved in a conversation, I use the word facilitate. Facilitate doesn't mean valueless, non-biased, transparent thing that makes something happen. What it means is a conversant who comes in with a set of values and makes them very clear and explicit, right? Now, as librarians, we do that, but we need to be willing to say, well, we're going to, in essence, suspend that for this question. But you're right, we need to be politically honest. When my other speeches, right, this is my 12-hour speech, radical change agent means when I look at LIS education, I think we do a great disservice to LIS graduates because we give them a grand vision, technology skills, and push them out the door, when what we need to give them are political skills, communication skills, and teach them how to go into organizations and subversively undermine them and recreate them. Right. So.
Can I make one more follow-up comment?
Sure.
You know, the other thing is that advertising is also information. It's really effective information. And so we have to not do that dichotomy of not-for-profit good advertising bad.
Yeah, I agree. Are you?
Well, let's take a couple more and then we'll...
I'd love to hear your comments on how to bring other people into creating the catalog. We had a patron who emailed us the day after an author died to inform us that we didn't close the dates on the author's information. And I mean, we were just astounded that someone actually really even noticed that sort of a detail. But I would love to hear more comments on that, and you know, and how you would open this up to. I'm assuming it's select people.
I'll send you back. First of all, because this is the 20,000th.